All right, I think we're just about at the start time, so I'll go ahead and get started. You're at Site Building Like a Software Engineer, so just make sure everybody's in the right session. A little bit about me. Fair warning, I'm not actually a computer scientist. I do not have a CS degree, but I do a lot of programming and have been for about 10 years, 15 years now. So I think of myself as a developer mainly. I'm the director of engineering now at Chapter 3, so I help wrangle a lot of our projects, help design a lot of, and architect a lot of our systems. And I've been working with Drupal now professionally for about 8 years, building sites for clients, dozens, maybe hundreds of sites at this point. Some of them are pretty small, and some of them, generate sites. So it's kind of hard to keep track at this point. But yeah, I've built a lot of Drupal sites. If you want to find me on Drupal.org, there's my user ID. I help maintain a couple of modules, throw patches at a bunch of other modules, occasional patches to core, that kind of thing, but not the biggest contributor out there. And I'm on Twitter, usually talking about development things. So what you hear in this presentation is also the kind of things I talk about on Twitter. So if you're interested, you'll get my thinly veiled complaints on Twitter about this kind of stuff. So this is some of the work I've been doing over the last few years has gotten me thinking about this session. I've been at a few clients and had to deal with for a little bit of reference, we're in San Francisco, Chapter 3 is in San Francisco, so we probably run into a lot more engineers than you would be used to. I mean, Austin, I think, is starting to turn into that kind of environment where everywhere you look in a coffee shop, somebody's got a terminal open or they're hacking some Python or something like that. But in San Francisco, you can't throw a rock without hitting an engineer of some kind or another. And what tends to happen is the clients already have people that know a lot about software development in place when they decide to move to Drupal. And those people have a lot of fixed paradigms in terms of their mindset and their thoughts about how we're going to design a system. So what they do when they're getting ready to start their Drupal site is head to the whiteboard and start drawing out database tables. And I've run into this 2 or 3 times now. And so this is what a software engineer thinks about when they're designing their system. I mean, it's well, Drupal's flexible. Everybody keeps telling me Drupal's flexible. So obviously, I'm just going to write some controllers and write some database tables, and Drupal will just conform its UI to my system. So this is the way we want to start thinking about our Drupal sites. We need to convince these people that Drupal's still an okay system, despite the fact that you can't control every last fine-grained detail about how it stores its data and how it's set up. So when you're a Drupal site builder, this is how you think about these things. Really, even if you know MySQL and you work in MySQL every day, and you write tables yourself and you write schemas for your own modules, you still, when you're doing your day-to-day site building work or you're architecting a Drupal site, you're not thinking about those tables. You might be as an afterthought, but you're not thinking about how this stuff gets stored. You're thinking about how Drupal is going to use it, how Drupal is going to access it, how Drupal's APIs are going to be thinking about this data. So this is where you're going to be doing most of your work. I've got some tools installed in my browser that allow me to do a lot of keyboard control through any website's UI, because I get tired of clicking so much. My wrist gets pretty sore by the end of the day. If you're working day in and day out in Drupal, you end up doing a lot of clicking around, especially when you're in that first week of developing a site. You're building out all your content types, you're building out all your views, you're building out all your blocks or panels, and so you do a whole lot of clicking. So what I wanted to try to do is say, let's find a happy medium here. Can we think about our site in terms of these inherent data structures? Can we think about it in a really high level and still get it squeezed in with all these tools, squeezed in with all these unique Drupal paradigms that Drupal brings to the table? So first off, we have to think about how we're going to be storing data in Drupal. And so this is the old guard. How many people have been using Drupal since version 4? Anybody in the room? All right. So a couple of these, taxonomy, content types, and menus, fields. Yeah, maybe not. It depends how much you like Flexi Node and that kind of thing. But Pretty much starting in Drupal 5, all of these were available and robust. And when you're architecting a Drupal site, this is where you went. So you ended up with a lot of things like overloaded taxonomies, where we have 10 different vocabularies, and it triggers a whole lot of different things about how the site's organized. Or you have something like the book module, where it overloads the menu system, and you're powering a big feature of your site using the menu system. So that being said, there's also really well-structured ways to deal with each one of these pieces. So I'm going to go through them one by one and kind of explain how I think about these when I'm architecting a site, and how some best practices I've seen by diving into a lot of client sites and a lot of people that have gone about it the wrong way as well. So when you're creating content types, the important thing to think about here is you should either have these predefined at the beginning of your project. If you have a development plan written out, you should have a naming scheme already figured out. So the name is really the most important part for this content type. And so I've seen a lot of sites where you start to get really bizarre things, like thingy 1, or like article 2 or article 3 or press release 4. You can very easily, over the lifetime of a site, get further and further and further, deeper and deeper into that hole. So if when you're first building the site, you come up with a really good naming scheme, it doesn't even really matter what it is, as long as it's like consistent and structured and well thought out. Then from that point on, it makes it harder. It's more obvious for the person that goes in and adds that 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th content type to follow that scheme. And you also have to be thinking, since we're software engineers thinking about Drupal, we need to fill out our descriptions. Like everywhere in Drupal, I was surprised as I was going through this presentation. There's not one place in Drupal where a description is a required field. I went through every part of Drupal. There's not one place where a description is a required field. But if you guys are software developers, if you commit a new function and you don't put a doc block at the top of it, like somebody's going to come back at you and ask, what does this function do? What are you thinking about here? So you should really be thinking about this the exact same way. It's like this is my doc block for this content type. Like, why am I creating this content type? Why did I need to create a unique content type? Why can't this be handled by a page? You can, in the case of the content type, you have a whole lot of area to put in a whole lot of thought process, and then everybody that goes in that tries to create a piece of that content, everybody that goes in to try to add a new field to that content type immediately understands your thought process. They don't have to go back, and say, where was the development plan for this site, and what were they thinking in terms of these content types? It should be like obvious in the UI right there when I'm going to work on that content type. So this is something I'd say probably less than 50% of Drupal sites with custom content types have any kind of description, and if they do, it might be one line that pertains to their initial impression of what this content type was going to do, and it doesn't have anything to do with what the content type actually ended up doing. So any time spent here is well worth it, and you also have to remember that once you type this in, just like code, this needs to be maintained. So you need to go back in, find this field again and update it if you're actually changing, fundamentally changing what this content type does. Or, if I just added 10 fields to this content type, you probably need to explain a little bit better what this content type's doing now. So it's a maintenance task as well as, an upfront task. So fields are something that would have come through in the Drupal 6 life cycle. Everybody was building sites with fields by the time Drupal 6 rolled around. So, these have been here a long time. We have we have a pretty good understanding of how to use them in the Drupal world. And what you need to think about here is you really start to need to think about the storage, not in terms of performance. I mean, there's a lot of information out there that will tell you you should share fields in this instance and you shouldn't share fields in this instance because the performance benefits here or there. My opinion about performance in Drupal sites is it should not be something that you worry about too much while you're building the site, because if you're creating an architecture that's optimizing for performance and you don't even have a good idea what the traffic's going to be like on the end site, you're probably making your architecture more complicated, and you're probably confusing yourself by worrying about I don't know. I haven't heard anything hard and fast about shared fields versus individual fields for content types in performance. So don't think too much about how it's being stored. You need to think in terms of the actual developer experience. So these site builders, the content owners, the people that are coming back into the site, the people that are maintaining this site, I'd say most Drupal sites have a lifetime of about 2 to 3 years. I don't know if anybody has experience of anything lasting longer. That seems to be like before a major version upgrade or major rebuild, you get about 2 to 3 years out of a Drupal site. And over that time, like, there's going to be a lot of people going in there. They're going to be looking at those field descriptions. There's going to be themers trying to figure out which field to theme. So those names that you use there and the way you store this information, that's going to get really important over time. And every time somebody tries to write something custom on top of this, they're going to be looking for that field. And if they can't find it because the name doesn't match up, a lot of times you'll see something along the lines of a display name that has nothing to do with the machine name and the database, because the machine name was way back from version 1, and the display name got updated to something that the client liked better. So you got to really be thinking in terms of, keeping everything in sync, keeping it all clear. Because if somebody's writing a migration script, if somebody's writing a custom module that's pulling data out of one of these fields, they're not going to be able to find it, and it's not going to make any sense to them. But it's also not going to make any sense to the site builders that are in the site. Once you get a certain number of fields, I know everybody's probably seen this, where you're looking at shared fields, and it's like, do I want to add this one to the content type? And you look through the list, you may have added those all personally yourself, but you have no idea what any of them do or how any of them are set up. Everybody knows that field creation screen. Do I have an example on the next page? No. So the field creation screen, you go through a multi-step form, and a lot of those decisions are going to stick with you the whole time. So my recommendation on fields is, don't worry about performance, and really don't bother sharing fields across content types. It's make unique fields for your content types. The sharing, all it's going to do is create that intellectual conflict. Is like, well, when I set that up, what did I check? Like, you have 3 or 4 more places to go back and check, like, what were the default settings, but if you don't share, you give them a good namespace that relates to your content type, then you end up with something that's a little bit more, there's a little bit less cognitive dissonance there when you're in there and you're working on the site. It's like, this field belongs to this content type. This content type, does this specific task because I can read the description of what that content type does. And we all have like a tight grouping of pieces of your site that work together. Taxonomies kind of work the same way. We have machine names. This is something I've started to see in a couple of Drupal sites. I really like it. Is in Drupal 7, you now have the ability to edit the machine name as it's being created. And so I've seen people going in and actually really carefully thinking about the namespace of their machine names, and they'll go in and edit it every time. You get the defaults, and the defaults will prefix it with something that doesn't make a lot of sense for your site. So if you go in and edit each one, if it's something custom for the client, namespace it with the name of the site. So you realize right off straight away it's not one of the defaults provided by Drupal because it's got the client's namespace on it. And remember, the description's your doc block for this taxonomy, for this vocabulary. So you have to give as much information you can to the next person that's going to land on this site. Or it's the same argument that everybody makes for software developers. It's not just the developer that's never worked on the site before. It's also you in 6 months when you've gone off to another project and you don't remember at all why you created this or what it was for. So menus. Menus, I think, are an interesting part of Drupal. Anyone that's tried to do custom development on top of the menu system will definitely maybe use a more strong word than interesting about the menu system. Menus tend to, I always get surprised about how people set up menus in their Drupal sites. You'll find one site where they have one nested menu that's 3 levels deep and has every menu item from the entire site in it. And then you'll move on to the next site, and every submenu is actually treated as a separate menu. And they'll do something creative in terms of how they load those, either block visibility settings or panels settings or something like that. And basically, it's always full of surprises. So I think the solution there is to actually think about your menus when you're creating them, instead of letting it be an organic thing that grows over time like a monster with multiple tentacles. So like, does it need to be broken off? Is it a tertiary menu that really doesn't have any relationship to the main navigation? Or is this tertiary menu really part of the main navigation? And I think that these decisions, well, it comes down to the client, but if you don't have a full sitemap for the site when you first start building the site, then that's when I think you end up with these monster scenarios where the menu just grows over time. And what happens is, as any developer that's tried to work with the menu system knows, if you can have these broken into discrete chunks that actually make sense, and you're going in and modifying those menu items, working with those menu items, adding breadcrumbs in one of the 15 different ways that you can do it in Drupal, it's much easier if these are logical chunks and you don't just have a massive structure that you're dealing with. So think ahead of time, and once you're adding those menus, make sure you specify the right menu to the right content type. That's a nice feature that came into Drupal 7, is I can say which menus are available when I'm creating this content type, so I don't allow people to throw a menu item in any place in the site. And you can sort of force your site users down this clear path. It's also, you're forcing the next site builder down this clear path. And if you can set up the right structure in the beginning, then the path stays a little bit more clear, and you actually have to do a lot more work to veer off of the path. So I feel like all of that was kind of simple, and it felt like by the end of Drupal 6, everybody was building sites the same. Every site you ran into was starting to look the same. It's CCK, content types, taxonomy. Maybe somebody went off the rails a little bit with node access control or something like that. But you got used to seeing a lot of the sites that were built the same way, and people were kind of conforming their structures to Drupal. Those software engineers that wanted to write their own database tables didn't have a lot of freedom. They weren't going to be able to create a lot of really complicated relationships between content types. Like, all of that stuff was, difficult enough that nobody tried to do it. But then entities came on the scene, and now all of a sudden data in Drupal has gotten a lot more complicated. And I feel like it's kind of fragmented out again. You're seeing a lot more creative architectures that are either organic over time, or somebody had a great idea and they're trying to sort of conform Drupal to their own ideas about how the system should be organized. So reference fields were available in Drupal 6. People started to get comfortable with the concept of reference fields, but then the flag and NodeQ as well were available in Drupal 6. But I feel like these have become commonplace, where you're going to see some of these, all of these, maybe all of them, maybe 2 or 3 of them in almost any Drupal 7 site. So reference fields are, I think reference fields are probably not used enough in Drupal to solve these types of problems. My theory on this is nodes are really robust. Nodes have been around forever. Every Drupal developer knows how to work with nodes. They know all the APIs that surround nodes. We have all sorts of access control systems built around nodes. We have all sorts of workflow systems built around nodes. We have, everybody's done a lot of work with nodes. Themers know how to theme nodes. Everybody knows about nodes in the Drupal world. And so what reference fields allow you to do is say, if I have a little chunk of data here that doesn't fit into a field conceptually, but it has fields itself. It's a collection of fields. I can create a separate content type for that. And when I create a separate content type for that, I can relate that content type back to the original node. So an instance of this would be, maybe a, trying to think. So if you have a book management system, you might have a category page for the book, and you want to relate all of the books back to their main category. That might not be a strict taxonomy page. It might be a node. Each category has its own node page. So you can relate that book back to that node instead of having to have a complicated taxonomy system. And along the same lines, each publisher could have a page in that site. So that you can relate each book to its publisher's page, and you can pull in all those publisher fields instead of duplicating all that content on each individual node. So these work really well for content-to-content relationships. Backlinking gets a little bit more complicated, but it's working better in Drupal 7 in terms of having the relationships actually work both ways, where one knows it gets linked to from the other. And I feel like, to me, this is the most robust, future-proof way to organize the content in your Drupal site. So if you can put it in a node, like leave it in a node, don't overcomplicate your life, because everybody knows how nodes work. From users to content, or from content to users, it works pretty well. Users in Drupal 7 now have fields. They're entities just like anything else. So you can pull in their information. So instead of just having an author field with an author ID and not much else, you could actually reference the author and get their entire user profile available then in your node, because you referenced out to that. The one downside to using reference fields for this type of architecture is that you have a little bit more theming work on your hands. You're kind of offloading some of the work. It's like, well, here's the information, here's these fields, but how we're going to display them becomes a little bit more complicated, because that information is not necessarily like intuitively available to the themer on the end. You either have to, as a developer, make that really clearly available to them, or explain to them where they're going to be pulling that information from. So you're kind of creating that one step removed. And that's what I'd like to stay away from when I'm developing these systems. Is I'd like everything to be pretty obvious, where it should be, where it's stored, how it's organized, how it's collected. And I feel like Drupal has a tendency to add 3, 4, 5 steps and start to get really, really complicated. And the more tools you have available to you, the more complicated you kind of make your life. So these make it a little bit more difficult on the theme side, but I feel like in the overall architecture sense, it's a lot clearer. It's like I can go to content list, I can see it there, I can build a view around it, it's pretty obvious I can build a view around this content. Like, none of that stuff is complicated. Now, if we want to make it complicated, Drupal provides the tools to us. Field collections is surprisingly popular, I would say. What it allows you to do is attach an entity to your node. So does everybody have like a really good idea about what entities are by this point? I know that I lead a user group where we let people come with their questions, and I'm still answering this question this far into the Drupal 7 cycle. So anybody want a rundown of these structures? I guess you wouldn't be here if you didn't know what an entity was. So what happens with field collections is we are attaching entities to a field. So if we create a field collection, we add a special type of field called a field collection to our node. And once we add this field, then we can set up this entity type that is attached through that field. And so what we just did is we added 2 layers of abstraction onto this information. So if I was using a reference field, we only have 1 layer of abstraction. There's a node and a node ID, and I'm referencing it directly. So if we add a field collection, we have an entity inside our entity, and so we're attaching it. So the point where this gets complicated, has anyone tried to write a migration with a field collection data, or tried to do a import, an XML import, or a SOAP import into a node with a field collection? It's exceedingly painful. It's beyond my cognitive ability to really understand how these things are stored. You're doing a lot of entity lookups. You're slowing those down massively by doing all those entity lookups and trying to insert items into these content types. So I think that field collections from a user interface perspective are interesting, because what it does is it removes that disconnect from the user's experience. But then from the developer and the site builder's experience, you've just added a couple of layers of disconnect. So when the user is creating a node with a field collection, to them, it's just magic. It's like I can click, I add a new field. I think you get a pop-up. I can't remember. You get a pop-up or something along those lines, and I can keep adding items. So in going back to the book example, it's I can, if the publisher doesn't already exist, I don't have to just reference it. I can sit there and add publishers from the node form, like over and over and over again. I can add 15 new publishers, and then they're all attached to this node. But what then happens is the storage is now tied to this node. So that publisher doesn't exist in the rest of the Drupal space. I can't reference that publisher from anywhere else. That publisher is part of this node. So with the node example, the publisher can live on its own. If I delete the content type, the publisher still exists. With the field collection example, it's embedded. It's buried in there. And the entity, is only attached to this node type. So there's cases where you need this, but I see people using it in the case where a node and a reference field would have been a lot better. I can't really think of any place I've seen this where it's done anything except improve the user experience. Now, it's a noble goal to improve the user experience, but you also don't want to then say, well, every time I need to do any custom development on this site, I have to double the number of hours because I improved the user experience by a little bit. There are some modules around Node references that actually allow you to do the same kind of UI. They're a little bit buggy and a little bit squirrely, I want to say, but they provide the same user experience, and then you get the good storage along with it. So this goes back to the main theme of the talk, which is we can't just think about the experience. We can't just throw another module on the site because it's cool and it kind of meets the client's requirements. We also need to think about how robust of a system are we actually ending up with in the end, and what is the system going to look like after people are adding code to it for 6 months, 8 months? How crazy is it going to get if we allow them to start modifying these things and adding their own field collections to their own nodes? How complicated is this going to get? So yeah, I mean, I've personally been burned by the field collection module, but there's probably a use case out there that I'm not thinking of that would be perfect for it. So field groups, I think, is actually what people want when they're adding field collections. The issue here is you can't add multiples, and I think that's where people add the field collections. It's when you want the multiple groups of fields. With a field group, all you're really doing is saying these 5 fields that I attach to my node are related to each other in some way. You don't actually have to specify what that way is. It's probably going to be in a very visual way. So the way that these will end up looking visually is it gives you different HTML wrappers. So if I have a field group on my node, it can be in a collapsible field set on the final display just by selecting a widget type that wraps all these fields in their own. So then visually on the end, so this is really a theme helper, but it's also allows the site builder / developer to point the themer in the right direction. It's as far as my data architecture is concerned, these fields are related. And so the themer immediately is going to see that, and the display is going to be a lot more obvious. So when the designer shows you something in the wireframe, where you have, say the content at the top, and then underneath it you have, a divider line and a bunch of listed fields. Those listed fields down at the bottom would be a perfect candidate for a field group because they're grouped together visually. They're grouped together mentally as the site owner is entering content. They're also going to be thinking about those as grouped together. They're thinking about that. There's always been that problem with Drupal. It's, I'm typing into a node form that's completely disconnected from the actual display. So a field group can make that a little bit closer in terms of these are grouped together on the final display. They're grouped together when I'm entering them into the content. So you can start thinking about your groups that way. So field groups, I think almost every Drupal site could use it. I think that node forms can become a huge disaster. You can use something like panels to force things into groups or stick things in columns, but that adds a lot of work on your end, where field groups could be a pretty quick, easy addition to a straightforward Drupal 7 site, and you get that going really smoothly. So flags, we kind of take a departure here, and we're going off in a little bit different direction. So we've been talking about entities and nodes and how they relate to each other. Flags aren't either of those things. They are just an arbitrary database value that says, yes, no about something. So a bookmark is probably the best case for a flag and is probably the most commonly used one. So if a user wants to bookmark a node, they will click the little flag icon at the top that says bookmark. They get a nice little JavaScript widget that flips over, and all of a sudden that node is flagged. Now this is where, as the software engineer in you is thinking, well, how is that information stored? Well, luckily with Flag, you get a nice API, so you can pull out that data really easily. It's got its own clear database tables. So this off-on value is stored for that user and that node. You have a relationship there between that user and that node. And the important part to think about Flag is that this is for the end users of the site. This isn't for the person that's editing the content. Because if the person is just editing the content and the person has access to edit the content, you already have Boolean fields when you're editing the content. So you click node edit, and you can flip an on-off value. And that's stored as a field. It's a lot easier to access. You don't have that extra layer of API integration to do. I've seen a lot of people where the administrators are using Flag as well. And so from a module developer standpoint, from an integration standpoint, you all of a sudden have this extra layer that you don't really need. It could all be stored in a field. Whereas a flag is really useful for a site user. Just an authenticated user can bookmark something, can flag something as inappropriate, can do all of those things, and you have a nice separate database table where that information is stored separately. Whereas if the site owner wants to do something like promoted to front page, or this is a hot item, where you get a nice little red star in the corner of it, they can do that all in the node edit form, and you don't want to have the overhead of Flag when you're dealing with that kind of thing. So yeah, you can't forget about using Boolean fields. I think they're really useful. I think they're underused in Drupal. I think that it gets confusing because you have promoted to front page and all of that down there. Now that we have fields integrated in Drupal core, it probably makes sense to finally retire promoted to front page because you can do that so easily with regular fields. So displaying data. So up to this point, we've really been talking about how everything gets stored in Drupal. And the storage is, everything in Drupal is going to be an entity at some point in the future. We're not quite there for Drupal 8, but every time a new release of Drupal comes out, somebody comes up with a new thing that's going to become an entity. So focusing on entities is probably your best bet in terms of learning about how Drupal stores data. But in terms of how Drupal displays data, the big one to learn about is views. So views is now integrated in Drupal core for Drupal 8. So even if you don't love views, you're going to have to deal with it. Views is basically a database query building engine. It builds extremely complicated database queries for you by, once again, clicking checkboxes. Drupal is all about clicking checkboxes. So if you're going to use Drupal a lot, you're going to be in the UI and you're going to be clicking a lot of checkboxes. And Views has the most checkboxes of anything. Well, maybe Panels. Panels probably beats it, but it's got a lot of checkboxes. And so this one, once again, I got a little bit horrified when I saw this one. When you're using the magic builder that comes with Views now, the description isn't even visible to you. You actually have to force it to turn on to even fill it out. I think it should be a required field, and they decided it wasn't even worthwhile enough to actually show it to the user and give up that valuable real estate. So the view name, the thing about view descriptions is you actually only get one line. So you're not thinking about doc block. This time you're thinking about code comments, because you can only fit in one line of a description for your views. So you got to figure out how to make yourself succinct, figure out how to give your view a really good name, and then really think about why you're creating that view. Because what you end up with is this screen here. This one was, I just installed some contrib booking module on my site, and I ended up getting like 7 or 8 views just from this one booking module. This is just like a development copy of a site. It wasn't even a production site. I know if you go into one of these forms on a production site, sometimes you'll have 50, 60 views listed here, and that doesn't even take into account how many views are actually hidden underneath those views in terms of displays. But luckily, Views gives you a lot of useful ability in terms of how you organize these things. So this is your one-line description. I think part of the reason it's one line is because you can't do much more than one line in this screen. You get something called type. Now, you have to create your views in code, I think, in order to get the type. I couldn't find the checkbox myself. I thought I had seen that at some point. But to define the type, which you see over on the bottom left, you can do that in custom code. And then you also get a tag. And the tags are really useful. They're really underused as well. For any time you see somebody building custom views, you rarely see any kind of tag put on a custom view. So you have to think in terms of what the experience is going to be like for the site builder once they're working on this site. That's really what you're thinking about in terms of how you're building these views. Another one that gets really underused in terms of this is actually the naming of the base view name. So you have the same problem we've seen elsewhere, which is the machine name doesn't have to have any relationship to the display name. There's a couple of JavaScript tools when you're creating views that try to make that match really closely, but you can also then override that and make the display name not have anything to do with the view name. Something that I do that probably might come off as controversial is I don't create displays. I create a base view for everything. I just plain don't do displays unless the information is like 90% shared. Because I don't like the UI, I don't like the experience, I don't like the headache of dealing with overridden fields. I feel like you can spend forever figuring out overridden fields, whereas you can also go up into the top right corner, click that drop down, hit clone, and you're immediately, all the fields are overridden. I'm starting over. I can give it a new machine name. I can give it a new display name. I can give it a new tag so that first screen is actually usable. And that display then isn't also hidden from me. I seriously find myself going into the code, going into the database to try to find the view name just so I can find it in this screen so I can click on it and change a couple of checkboxes. You know, it's supposed to be easy, user-friendly, but if I have to go in the database to find the view name, then that means it's not really user-friendly to somebody that doesn't even know how to do that. So yeah, it's probably not a great performance concern because Views does pretty good caching, and so that means each one of my individual views needs to get cached separately. But for me, it's site building is the number one concern. You know, maintenance is the number one concern until performance becomes an issue. You can spend a lot of time, you know, optimizing performance. You know, if you really find that, you know, not having shared displays is hurting your performance, you can combine them at that point. But I feel like premature performance optimization has led to a lot of like really bad Drupal architectures. So, you know, don't bother until performance is actually a concern. Most Drupal sites don't have millions of users. Most of them have hundreds of users. And if you have Varnish running with hundreds of users, you're not going to feel a lot of performance pain until you get Slashdotted or something like that. So Drupal being, you know, loving complication, you know, contrib authors loving like writing something cool. We have also hybrids that store values and display values. So NodeQ, I would consider one of these hybrids. How many people have used NodeQ in the room? It seems to be like really popular. So NodeQ is just for maintaining lists of nodes. And that seems like a simple task, but the issue here is the order of that list is the hard part. If you don't care about order, then once again, go back to your node type and just add a Boolean field. It's like, I add this to my list. You know, what's my list? You know, bookmark nodes, I don't care what order they're displayed in. All I need is a Boolean field on the original node type. I don't need to worry about a whole separate UI, a whole separate module, a whole separate set of database tables. I can do it all in one Boolean field. So a list of nodes is then prepared by this module. It has its own UI, which I think a lot of people dislike the UI on this. So each node display is going to have the ability to add it to the queue. And then you also can go maintain the queue separately where you have a reference field. So I'm typing in a node ID, I'm typing in a node title, and I'm adding it to the list. I personally use NodeQ because I really like its API. So that once again, I'm thinking about the developers and the site builders. I'm not thinking about the end user so much. But NodeQ has a really easy to use API from a module development standpoint. So you can go pull that information out really easily. You can pull that list out really easily. You can work with that list. You can modify that list really easily. So the thing to keep in mind here is, you know, NodeQ doesn't really have a way to display its results on its own. It really needs views to do its work. So what NodeQ provides to views is you get sorting, so you can pass in the sorting straight to views, and then you can pass in the filtering straight to views. So NodeQ does a lot of the work for you, whereas otherwise your views arguments might get pretty complicated. NodeQ can handle a lot of that work for you. It's pretty straightforward. So Draggable Views takes NodeQ and kind of abstracts it out to the extreme. What it allows you to do is you can reorder anything that you can display in a view is kind of the goal. That may not deliver in terms of reality, but yeah, Draggable Views gives you a draggable interface. So everybody's reordered the block page or reordered a menu in Drupal, and you know how that kind of interaction works. Draggable Views works the same way, but each row of that view will then become draggable. So what this allows you to do is create really slick, clean UIs. One of the developers I work with that is always thinking about the user experience loves this from the user experience standpoint. You can create a really slick, clean experience in terms of how you're ordering a list of things. So this list of things can be any entity in Drupal. So this can be fields, it can be taxonomies, it can be nodes, and what you can do then is reorder. You save that draggable view, and then that order of those items is stored in the database. So whereas NodeQ deals specifically with one item that's been in Drupal for a really long time and does it in a really clean and clear way, Draggable Views opens up that possibility to all sorts of things. So the question you need to ask yourself here is, how am I doing this? What's my goal behind? Why do I need to know the order of these things? What's the point? Why am I doing this? You can reorder taxonomy terms on the taxonomy page. Do I really need to create a new interface for that and store it someplace separately where I have two shadow interfaces and I'm not sure which one I'm using when I'm actually displaying it? So this one, I'm surprised nobody booed when I brought up the slide. Configuration management is another point where the software engineers start to cringe and start to try to convince people that maybe they should move away from Drupal. Configuration management is kind of something taken for granted in a lot of systems. It was assumed from the very beginning to be important, and Drupal was one of the first database. One of the first, well, not one of the first systems, but it was one of the first big open source systems where it's like, let's store everything in the database. And by everything, I mean everything in the database. And there's very little outside of an info file and like core Drupal that's, that looks kind of like a setting that's not stored in a database. So we got a few options with configuration management. So to I guess go around the problem a little bit more. So the main issue we care about this, the main reason we care about this is because all of these values, all of these things we've changed, we might have more than one database. And the production database is usually untouchable. It's some clients will let you log into the production database and start changing configuration. Some won't let you anywhere near it with good reason. Some clients, the production database is the only copy of the database besides hopefully a backup. So it's no problem. I'll log in, I'll change it on production, I'll fix the bug right away. The site might go down for a couple of minutes, but hey, who cares? There's only 200 users anyway. But the issue becomes once you get into an enterprise environment. So they're saying we're going to have a release every 6 months of configuration. And that's the only time you're going to get new configuration up to the site. Now, how are you going to manage that if everything's stored in the database and we can't log into the production database to update it? So here's one way you can manage it. This is actually somebody's biology notes. I couldn't find a good example of somebody writing down their Drupal deployment steps, but so I've done this. I still do this. And my rule of thumb here, it's the same one I use for migrations. If I can do it quicker by clicking checkboxes than I can do it in terms of dealing with features, then I'll do it by checking checkboxes. And I'll make sure I check the right checkboxes, and I'll QA my own work and make sure it's correct. And so this is my rule of thumb. If I can fit all the steps on one page, it's going to be faster than dealing with a feature in the long term. So if everything fits on one page, then just check the checkboxes, bite the bullet. I like to use Vimperator. Does anybody use Vim for coding? So Vimperator is a Firefox extension that uses Vim key bindings. So you can start checking checkboxes really fast, basically from your keyboard. So it's worth checking out. And so anyway, you can check a lot of checkboxes. You make sure you check the right checkboxes on production, and you deploy that to the production. You also have CTools Export API, which I think is awesome, which I think is sadly underused. I feel like if everybody had embraced CTools Export API, we wouldn't have even needed a configuration management initiative for Drupal 8. It's like it had all the pieces, it was ready to go, but Sadly, only panels and views and then a few other smaller contrib modules decided to use it. And so what it does is it takes Drupal's standard data structures and allows you to map them to configuration files. And those configuration files can be exported and saved. You can maintain those. And it also has the ability to sort of keep track of differences. So it's really simple. It's really straightforward. It's really easy to implement. There's still time. Drupal 8's still 6 months out. You can still get CTools support in your module. And but yeah, it only works for panels and views, so not really worth investing too much energy in at this point. But everybody's seen this, probably without even realizing it. Every time you click export and views and you get that dump, that's the CTools export API. And the hidden secret of Drupal is that was available to everyone to use because everybody has CTools on their site if they use views. But sadly, it was underused. So instead, we ended up with features, which is how everything else in Drupal got fit into an export API. So features was filling an obvious problem in Drupal. Somebody had to do it. A development seed finally bit the bullet and figured it out because they were trying to support Open Atrium and realized it was completely impossible without being able to store configuration. You can't have features from version to version of Drupal. You can't maintain that over a long period of time without having some sort of configuration stored. And you need to be able to store that in version control, which means you need to have it in a file, not in the database, because nobody wants to be diffing databases, especially when you have like a 10 gig Drupal database with thousands of nodes in it. You don't want to be diffing that for configuration. So the main issue with features, and I hear a lot of these are cleaned up for features 2.0, but my experience with features has been nothing but pain. It's large, it's complicated. You have a lot of add-on modules in order to get things into features. It's sometimes inconsistent. I find it to be very inconsistent with features 1. Menu items, you're never going to get them working because menu items aren't stored in a way to be features compatible. And that's really the fundamental problem. I can't blame features for trying, but everything in Drupal until Drupal 8 was stored in a way that was database centric. We didn't care about matching IDs. We kind of assumed there was only one database. Drupal never really thought about multiple databases and deployment and staging. It wasn't architected that way. And so features just basically built a wide system around maintaining that, trying to maintain that. But when you don't have a unique ID attached to something, each node has a unique ID. So it's a little bit more straightforward for nodes in maintaining them across systems. But menu items don't really have a unique ID in terms of related to all the other menu items in the node. The parent menu itself doesn't have a unique ID. And so that means that you get a lot of clashes. You get a lot of confusing things. You get a lot of features that are always overridden, always broken, or it's only broken on one site, or it's only broken when you deploy it to production and you don't know why. The other side of features is you get a lot of maintenance overhead. And I think people that use features to deploy this for clients and then don't actually work on that site over the lifetime of the site maybe don't realize this. But once you have features on your site, you're stuck with it forever. And if you don't maintain those features, the next time you go back and try to do some serious development on the site, it's like features brings you no benefits at all besides a lot of work to get those features up to date. So once those features are there, I have a patch. If anybody's interested, I'll tell you the secret patch, in the issue number that actually gets your content out of features. But that's, as far as I know, still the only method to get your content out of features is to apply a patch to Drush, and then it goes through and it returns all of your content back to the normal way it's stored in the database. So features is kind of like a virus. It takes once you get it in there, it's going to be really hard to get it out, and it's going to bring a lot of overhead. Now, I still recommend features if you have a team of people working on the site, and that team of people is going to continue working on the site for the lifetime of the site. So if I go into a big organization, they've got 4 or 5 Drupal developers, some front-end developers, some back-end developers, and they say, we want to maintain configuration, and I say, use features. But then you have to really think about, what are we naming these features? What is contained within each feature, and those features need to be maintained every week. Like, you can't think about those features like once every 3 months. You got to maintain those features every week. You've got to make sure that the CEO didn't log into the production site and change a bunch of stuff, because that happens. And you've got to make sure that you then pull that down, because the CEO's changes are the most important changes, of course. And so all of that just takes a lot of time, a lot of work. So when you're architecting your plan for your Drupal site and you're thinking about configuration management, make sure that you realize what you're getting with features, and don't just throw it on there, because it makes it easy for your developers to deploy the changes while you're building the site, and then leave the client with it forever and not really explain what they need to do with it. So yeah, these are to sum up my configuration management advice. You can wait for Drupal 8, which I'm kind of doing that. I'll put features on a site if I desperately have to, but I'm kind of waiting for Drupal 8. Write it down, fit it on one page, and you can face the idea of actually clicking all those checkboxes yourself, or if you're lucky enough, I guess you have an intern that you can make go check all those checkboxes and you trust them. Or features and CTools, and watch it like a hawk. I've had good luck with just keeping everything in CTools. I find that those are where the most changes often get made. View display settings. So I've just used CTools, not put any of that CTools stuff into features, but have it just in regular straight export files, and that's worked pretty well for me. So that's it for me. Anybody have any questions, comments? I think I raised some controversial points about how I build sites, so if you want to shout me down, that's fine too. Yeah.
I may not be as clear on entities as I thought I was, so a little bit of discussion about entities might be useful.
So for a long time, everything was all about nodes in Drupal. A lot of custom modules, and like back in the Drupal 5 days, which you would write your own custom node type in a module. And so it became apparent that we needed like a sort of unified structure that we could store everything in. So that's really what an entity is. It's a amorphous structure that we can use for anything. So the node itself is an instance of an entity. That entity is the content type. And also each field within that is also its own entity. So everything gets treated the same. Everything is part of the same data structure, which means then we have unified APIs. So theoretically, I should be able to reference my nodes with the entity queries the same way I reference my fields with the entity query. And over time, more and more things. I think for Drupal 8, we're getting comments. Maybe that issue still seems a little bit rocky. We might get comments as entities, and people always talk about doing menus as entities, but nobody's actually taken on that battle and figured it out. But that's a big one. That's a rough one. But once you get used to using entities and referencing them in your code, then you want more and more things to be in entities, because you have that unified way to get at everything. Any more questions, comments?
Are you going to post your PDF on the site, perhaps?
Yeah, I can post it in the comments, or maybe on SlideShare or something like that. Yeah.
Perfect.
You had mentioned some keyboard shortcuts in the browser. Was that specifically that Firefox plugin you're talking about, or something?
Yeah, the question was keyboard shortcuts in the browser. I use Vimperator. There's also one called Pentadactyl, and there's one for Chrome, but Chrome's has a little bit better security controls around JavaScript, so that means you can't write as cool things for it. So it doesn't work as well in Chrome, but it works really well in Firefox. So Vimperator and Pentadactyl, I think they're forks of the same project. Yeah. Any more questions? All right, thank you very much. Thanks for coming.